chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. And so, like I said already, this is our Village Missions Sunday, and we're going to talk a little bit about village missions. We're going to talk a little bit about some things in the Bible first, and then use that as a springboard to talk about what we're going to do with village missions here. So Matthew chapter 6 is where we're going to begin. Starting next week, just so you know, we are going to start a new series out of the book of Isaiah, and it's just 7 verses out of 1 chapter is the whole series. And it's going to be in Isaiah chapter 9, and it's going to be called Great Light for Life. So if you want to read ahead, feel free to do that. For right now, Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19, is where we are going to be. And your first fill-in up here on the screen, is that Jesus calls us to do treasure differently. Jesus calls us to do treasure differently. And the scripture is up on the screen for you. If you don't have a Bible with you, you can follow along up there. Jesus says this: "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. So if we're going to kind of just take a little bit of a moment here and examine this, Jesus calls us to do treasure differently. And so he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we think about treasures, that we think about wealth, that we think about possessions, that often need some serious course correcting. Yes, we just came off of a time, just a couple of days ago, that is called Black what? Black Friday. Does anybody know why it's called Black Friday? A couple of you do. Can you tell me what it is, Erwin?
It's the first day that business are profitable.
Yes. Yes, it's about the profitability of the business. So the difference between, if you're the kind of a person who keeps a ledger about, your income versus your expenses, if you have in your ledger a sum of money, like, okay, so you have in the bank money, right? You have a profit, you have kind of a surplus. It is written in black, or it used to be written in black ink. If you had a negative amount, like you owed money and you didn't have money, it would be red. So if you were in the red, it would be a bad thing. But if you were in the black, it would be considered good. And that's why Black Friday is called Black Friday. Here's your trivia for today. But it's this idea of we have to move enough merchandise, we have to push enough stuff out onto the shelves and discount and do whatever it is, so that our coffers can be full and so that our ledgers can be in the black. That's for the business side of things. But the reality is that for many people who are the shoppers on Black Friday, what happens is that they end up in the red. Right? They end up with a little bit of a deficit. They end up with, boy, I really owe a lot of money on my credit card next month, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to reach that, at which point you may want to consider doing a little plastic surgery. So that's just a little thought for you there. Your friends can explain that to you if you don't get it. But the idea of it's all about the stuff, it's all about the treasure, it's all about the things, it's about the resources, it's about the exchange of money. And there are a couple of things that I want to talk about in terms of how we think about treasure, how we think about wealth, how we think about resources that may need just a little bit of course correcting, particularly in a time of the year when it becomes about spending, when it becomes about going and allocating funds to buy certain things Christmas presents, cards, food, all sorts of the stuff that we just normally associate with the season that might end up putting us personally in the red. Because Jesus says this, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. I want to say a couple of things about what Jesus is not saying when he says that, or a couple of things that Jesus is not trying to get us to think when we think about treasure or resource or wealth. What Jesus is not saying is he's not saying physical resources, he's not saying having money, he's not saying having possessions is in and of itself a bad, evil thing. Which is a route some people are tempted to go. It is a route that some people will go, well, it's better, it's actually a good thing to be in poverty. It's a good thing to have less, because then we're not going to be assaulted by the greed problem, or we're not going to be assaulted by the idea of we're controlled by our wealth. And while there is a tinge of truth in that, that's not what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not saying, get rid of everything because it's evil to have wealth. Or get rid of everything because it's evil to have resources at your disposal for use. Jesus is not saying that. He's simply saying, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. It's the idea of, you're not like, okay, so has anybody here read or seen the movie The Hobbit? A couple of you. So there's just so few of you. I'm so disappointed. So let me backtrack and tell you then. So there is this band of people, these dwarves, these characters who are dwarves, and they have to go and take back what was taken from them, which was their home. And in this home, there is this vast pile of gold and silver and gems and wealth and resources. And they are going to take it back because it was stolen from them by this huge fire-breathing monster of a dragon named Smaug. And the idea behind the dragons are that the dragons are these creatures that simply hoard for themselves wealth. They lay on their wealth, they sleep on their wealth, they keep close guard over their wealth, they defend their wealth, they will destroy anybody who comes near their wealth. Because they are these creatures, they embody the idea of greed. And these dwarves, they're like, well, that belonged to us, and so we're going to go take it back. And then some of them begin to struggle with this greed problem. They become a little bit dragon-ish in their understanding of what belongs to them and what doesn't. So it's this idea of do not hoard for yourself. Do not simply make it about, I've got a bigger pile than you do. It is not about getting a bigger pile. It is not about... Because what happens then is it becomes a competition and it becomes a status thing. God is not interested in your status. God is not interested in your better standing than your neighbor. It's not a competition for God. We do not attract God by our external realities of wealth and resource and anything. God doesn't look at us and go, oh, well, that person has the resources. I'm going to make sure that I have him on my side. That's not what God does. Because the Psalm says this, Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Every bit of wealth, every bit of resource, every bit of possession that you have is not yours. It belongs to God. Everything belongs to God. He made it. It is His. It belongs to Him. And God is the one who decides how best to channel those resources. So God is not saying, or Jesus is not saying here, that having physical resources, that having wealth, that having all that, He's not saying that that's evil. So that's not the route that He takes. And there's an opposite thing also here that Jesus is not saying, which is pretty obvious, but some of us miss this as well. That this is not about this false sort of prosperity gospel. You know the prosperity gospel? Right? Those people on TV who say if you send in money, they have hair that like is 3 feet high or whatever, and they have way more makeup than any human should be able to wear at one time. Right? 1-800-BIG-HAIR is what it is. It's this idea of if you give away your money to me, then God is going to bless you. And this is what and it is a false gospel. Okay, let's call it for what it is. It is not true. It is hatched in the pit of hell. It is not what God is saying about the gospel. The gospel is not give your money and then God will make you very, very comfortable. Get rid of your resources and then God will make sure that everything is going to be just fine for you. No, that is false. It is heretical. It is nowhere in the teaching of Scripture. So Jesus is not saying, get rid of your stuff, it's evil. Jesus is not saying, get rid of your stuff and I'll make sure you're well taken care of. He very simply says, don't hoard. Don't make a bigger pile for yourself expecting that to take care of you. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on the earth. Well, why not, Jesus? Because moth and rust destroy it and thieves can break in and steal it. All of that stuff is impermanent. It's not permanent. It will not last. And because it is transitory in nature, because it does not last by its nature, it can give no lasting security. And so many people turn to their wealth and say, make me feel better about myself. So many people go to their checkbook to see whether or not they are doing well. And they use that as a guide for their emotional stability or instability. And your wealth, your resources, your possessions simply are unable to provide that. Here's the problem. That kind of a disorder, because it is a disorder, is a disorder of worship. It is a disorder of worship. Anytime we move God out of His place in our hearts and substitute anything else there, it will cause us damage. Because here's the reality. You become like what you worship. We were made to worship God. We were made to worship God. We were designed to worship God. And when we substitute in something else besides God, if you substitute in wealth, you become a calculator. You become like what you worship. You become tied to that which you worship. So are you a person here who worships at the altar of the bank? Are you here a person who worships at the altar of the mall or Amazon or any of the other places where those transactions happen? Do you go and you find your sense of security in those moments? The problem with that is that you are in the process of laying up for yourselves treasures on the earth. You are making those treasures the prominent thing, and they simply will not satisfy. They simply will not do. Second fill-in for you is this. Jesus calls us to see the eternal value of resources. Jesus calls us to see the eternal value of resources. Matthew 6:20. But, and he continues, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and thieves do not break in and steal. Part of using a resource rightly requires knowing the value of resources rightly. Part of using a resource rightly, or using wealth, or using possessions, or how we hold on to those things in the right way requires us to see value in them appropriately. And so here's the reality, is that the things that God puts into our lives, or the things that God allows into our lives, resource, whatever, are not for worship, they are for service. They are not for worship, they are for service. To understand the value of your bank account, you have to understand this, that is not simply there to serve a bland, non-spiritual function in your life. Your bank account is there to serve the one true living God, who has shown himself to rule and to reign through the resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. Your bank account exists. Every resource in your possession exists, ultimately, for service to the one true God. It is not about worshiping the resource, it is how we use the resources to worship God. And so that's in part why we do things here like we do with the offering. Part of that is taking what the scriptures would refer to as the first fruits of what comes into your bank accounts or your resources or your whatever, and giving that to God, and giving that to God for his use. It already belongs to him, but it is specially dedicating those things for the specific purpose of service to God. So when you give, for example, part of that money goes into the general fund here at church. And that will go to do things like, well, it keeps the building running, keeps the electricity paid, but it also goes toward things like paying salaries and making sure that the various areas of ministry, children's ministry, music ministry, all of the stuff that this church does to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ happens on account of the money that you put into the offering. Right? So it is far more than a financial transaction. It is an act of worship, and it is an act of service. It is an act of worship, and it is an act of service. And to do that well requires us then to take an honest look at the resources that are in our possession and to understand those things rightly. To understand that it is not simply about giving me a good fuzzy feeling that I have this, whatever it is, in my possession. And it's all right to have a good feeling. Okay, don't hear me saying that you have to walk around sour all of the time. God enjoys it when we enjoy him. God enjoys it when we enjoy his creation. That's fine. That's good. That's actually part of the design. But understand this, it is about laying up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's about understanding the heavenly or the eternal value of the resources that come under our stewardship. And the word for you is stewardship, not ownership. Because everything is owned by God. We are the stewards or the caretakers over wealth, resources, possessions, things like that. Sometimes things will pass into your life that get to pass right back out of your life for a specific purpose, like almost right away. And sometimes something will come into your possession that will be there for years, that you will not see the immediate use of. But one day you will come across and go, well, I know what's perfect for this is this thing that's been in my possession for years and years and years. And that God has had me steward that for a long time so that I can now, at this moment, channel that into this area of need. Okay? Do you understand? Are you tracking with me? Is that there is an understanding that needs to happen about what is in our possession, what's in our bank accounts, what's in our whatever. That it all belongs to God and that it is currently being stewarded by us for eternal purposes, for eternal realities. It's not simple financial transaction. You cannot strip the reality of God's ownership and stewardship and purpose for anything in his created order. You cannot pull that away. There is not a single molecule that God has created that does not serve some purpose in his plan. Everything, the scripture says, was created by God, for God. Everything was created by God, for God. He has a purpose over and for everything. It's important that we don't assume earthly value for resources that have an eternal value. It's important that we do not simply assume a cheap, meaningless, frivolous value over something that is something that God has planned eternally to use for his kingdom. Number 3. Jesus calls us to understand our hearts. Jesus calls us to understand our hearts. Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So over these 3 verses, there's a very simple progression that happens. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Do not misread the purpose of your resources as simply earthly. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And then this third part, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So there are 2 essential kind of locations given: earth and heaven. Earth and heaven. And heaven is very simply this. It is wherever in creation God's rule and reign is apparent. So Jesus teaches us, for example, in the next chapter, in Matthew chapter 7, to pray. And how does he teach us to pray? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. We sanctify your name. Sacredize your name all over the place. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Come. Your will be done where? On earth. How? As it is in heaven. So there's this very simple understanding of heaven is meant to crash into earth. That's Jesus' plan. The plan is not to remove us from earth forever into a kind of a floaty heaven away from everything physical someday somewhere. The plan of God is always coming back down to earth. It is always about how God is going to recreate heaven and earth together into a new heavens and a new earth. So all of the physical earthly resources that you have access to, there is a heavenly purpose for. There is an eternal heavenly purpose for every earthly resource that is in existence. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures simply on the earth. Why? Because heaven is going to crash into earth. And when it does, it will transform the merely earthly. It will transform the merely physical into something that you have never seen or thought of before. Understand this, you actually see this happen in the resurrection of Jesus. Right? When Jesus dies on the cross for our sins, and then he's raised again on the 3rd day, Jesus is he's kind of like a little bit different. He's not exactly the same as he was before his death. It's not a simple resuscitation. It is Jesus' own body is the epicenter of the new creation. It's the epicenter of the new creation. That Jesus shows that there is a transformed physicality to the new creation. So it's not that physical resources, physical wealth, physical anything is in and of itself bad. It's simply that it has an eternal heavenly purpose which has yet to be shown. And part of our work is to practice the heavenly purpose in the here and now in anticipation of God's kingdom coming and His will being done on earth as it is in heaven. So, with all of that in mind, with all of that kind of shooting through our understanding of, well, that's what resources, that's what wealth, that's what possessions, that's what all of that is about, I want to talk to you a little bit about village missions. I want to talk to you a little bit about village missions. Now, this is what village missions is. Village missions exists to glorify Jesus Christ by developing spiritually vital churches in rural North America. Village missions places pastors in small town churches that might otherwise have to close, and in doing so, preserve the gospel presence in over 220 communities across the United States and Canada. All right, so let's go ahead and just pick that apart. So the Village Missions is an organization, all right? So it's sort of like a parachurch organization. It exists and it comes up alongside of existing churches to help. And the way it helps is it develops spiritually vital churches in rural North America. So it's got its focus, it's got its point or kind of its purpose or whatever aimed at rural churches. Now you understand what rural is as opposed to urban or suburban. It's normally kind of the farmland places. It's normally the sort of the out-of-the-way places. It's the tiny small towns that are normally out in the middle of nowhere that you don't even go around or don't even go to go through, but you will normally go around and maybe not even notice that those places exist. That's what village missions, that's what its purpose is. Village missions exist to develop spiritually vital churches in places just like that. This is a village missions church. At one point, this was a very small little church that started over 100 years ago. It started out on the beach with bonfires, right? If you were here during the 100th anniversary celebration a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, you heard some of this story. Some of you may not know this story. But this church began when this was kind of a logging area, work area, a place where stuff would happen it was just sort of well, this is where the wood resources are, and so logging would happen here. But it eventually became a little bit of a town along the railroad track there. We still have the railroad track. But also, at some point, somebody said, well, we need some sort of gospel preaching church here. So they started with some bonfires in the evening and some Bible study and some stuff like that. Well, that eventually became a point where they said, well, we need to actually establish then a little bit more of a permanent church here. And so they built their first building, which is the Lions Club building down at the end of the street. That was the original church building. And then they outgrew that. And they said, well, let's build ourselves another building. And in 1974, this building was constructed. Right? And then some changes have happened here and there since. And we're obviously looking at doing a few more changes starting tomorrow. But the idea for village missions is that it finds these churches that are in rural areas where normally those churches cannot afford or attract a pastor that's a full-time pastor. And so what often happens in places like that is those churches just die. They simply die. They become husks of themselves, and then they become nothing. And people will just sort of float off and do nothing with Christ. And so Village Mission says, oh, no. We will do what we can to help those churches stay alive and preserve the gospel present. So there are over 220 communities across the U.S. and Canada. Most of them are in the United States. There are several in Canada. Most of them are here. Where if it were not for village missions, those churches simply would not be there. Because somebody somewhere along the line said, it is more important that the resources that I have in my possession go to the sustaining of dying churches in small areas that cannot afford a pastor, that cannot afford to do ministry of any kind. It is more important that that happens than I use this wealth simply to enjoy myself. And many people got together and eventually said, yes, we agree. And it became an organization, and that organization now supports 220 churches. And some of these churches are like, I read about one the other day in Canada that was, over half of the church was the pastor and his family. Which was like, they were 6. So, about 12. About 12 people. So let's talk a little bit more about village missions. In your bulletin, you will have kind of you'll notice that your bulletin was probably a little bit bulkier today. But you'll have something that has this graphic on it. And so there are currently 204 village missionary couples, which is what I am. My wife, Rachel, and I, we're a village missionary couple. Okay? Which means that we were placed here. Now, normally what you would think in a church is a church that is without a pastor will go through like a really long candidating process, right? And they will see hundreds and hundreds of resumes and sermon tapes and all sorts of stuff and kind of go, well, who do we select out of this? Well, Village Missions bypasses that headache by creating a profile of people like me and my wife, who's downstairs with kids, doing kid stuff right now. Our oldest daughter's up here, though. Hello. So they'll create a profile of us, and they'll create a profile of each church, and they will do a match thing. And well, what works best here? And so they will create a profile match. It's sort of like Match.com, except for with churches and pastors. It's a little bit like that, I guess. Except for there's significantly less dating involved, and hopefully less frustration, I guess. But the idea is, so there are about 204. Now, you'll notice that one of the earlier numbers I said is that there are 220 communities, which means that there are present about 16 churches that are without somebody right now. That are still completely without any kind of qualified, biblically trained pastoral leadership. Which is one of the things that Village Missions is very interested in, is finding biblically trained and qualified pastoral leadership. They simply will not take just anybody. I can tell you that my interview process, or our interview process, was a pretty long one. It started out with a 3-hour in-home interview with a district representative. We have a district rep here, different guy though. A 3-hour in-home interview, which then went to a really long, like 10-page application. Actually, the application was first. But the application was very complex, very long, and it took us a while to get through it. And then we did the 3-hour in-home interview, and then we did a week-long training or candidating process, what's called candidate school, that they try to hold every spring and fall, and where they will gather interested parties, interested people, and they will basically, hang out with us for a week to see whether or not people fit what they're trying to do. And then there are always people who say that this isn't for us, and there are always people who the mission says, sorry, you're not for us. Because they're interested in qualified leadership. Qualified is sort of the key word. They simply will not just throw anybody at a church. So that's why there are 204 churches right now that have village missionary couples. And actually some of those, I believe, are retired or associate missionaries. And an associate missionary is somebody who's not full-time in a church. They simply go there to be basically a placeholder until they can find a full-time pastoral leader for that place through the candidating process. So the reality is that there are probably closer to 190 full-time village missionary couples, and the rest is probably made up of associate missionaries who are there just to hold down the fort until somebody can be sent fully. So this past year, there were 9 new churches that were added to Village Missions, and they're there for you. Mesquite, California, Breezewood, Pennsylvania, Atlanta, Michigan, Andover, Amargosa Valley, Dunsmuir, Gabbs, Rock, Audubon. Brand new churches to the mission. And anytime that there are brand new churches to the mission, there always is then a need for more village missionaries to be raised up. There were 365 child salvations last year, an average of 1 per day. Because of Village Missions churches, there were 160 adult salvations because of Village Missions churches. One of them happened here. Village Missions matters greatly. The average attendance for Canada is 32. The average attendance of a U.S. church is 45. So we are actually significantly over that. We're almost double that, or sometimes more than double that on any given Sunday. So imagine just cutting this in half. And that's probably what your average Village Missions church looks like. Probably more like this half over here. There were 149,672 hours spent visiting in the community this year by village missionaries, myself and people like me. Spent just hanging out with people, going to dinner, having people in our homes, going to movies together, going and hanging out, going and visiting people in the hospital, doing all kinds of things like that. None of those hours would be there. It worked for Village Missions being in many of those churches. There are 7 districts with 7 district representatives. Some of you know Gil Diebler, who is our district representative. He lives down south of us by a few hours, but he'll come up about twice a year just to check on us, see how we're doing, seeing if there's anything that can be done to help in whatever area, or just saying, hey, here's how the mission is doing, here's something that we want to see happen, or whatever. About 50% of Village Missions churches need help to pay salary and insurance. So you're looking at about 100, at least 100 churches that if it weren't for Village Missions, doors close. The doors would close. So that's some interesting, just some interesting numbers for you there to kind of help you understand what is going on with Village Missions. Village Missions does a number of other things besides supplying qualified leadership and helping churches to be spiritually vital. One of the things that it does is something called Contenders Discipleship Initiative, which is sort of a recent thing that started up. So it's essentially this. It is a tuition-free Bible college kind of training. It's about a 2-year program, and it's not even complete yet, but they've started it, understanding that they're going to do add more courses to their. And what it is it's internet-based. You can go online if you have a good internet connection and go and basically sit down in recorded Bible training sessions. And this does a number of things. The first thing it does is that it just helps people to be better trained in knowing the Word of God and knowing how to study the Word of God. And it's completely free. Any one of you could sit down and go to vmcontenders.org and just start up the program without really spending a dime. There are some resources that you probably have to buy a couple of books here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty much just free. This is the sort of thing that would cost you probably a couple of $1,000s to do anywhere else, but they wanted to offer it tuition free. Second thing that it does is that it helps Village Missions to find or to raise up other qualified pastoral leaders. Part of its design is to help instigate in the hearts of some people who are studying through the course to kind of go, you know what? I could do this. I could do this. One of the final courses that's still yet to be added is sort of a pastoral course. Kind of a training to help do some basic counseling and how to preach the Bible and how to do some evangelism and things like that. So it's the sort of thing that if there's somebody here in this room today who kind of has always had I know that I sort of have a gift from God of being able to explain the Bible to other people, or I just enjoy doing that. It's something that is happening in me that God is saying there's something good here. Well, that may be God saying, okay, well then let's get started on getting you on the path to help and be helpful somewhere, maybe even in a village missions church. So Contender's Discipleship Initiative was started in part to raise up other leaders, to raise up other people. And also in part just to help people who feel like, you know, I just want to know the Bible more. I just want to know better how to approach the Scriptures, how to study the Bible. There are classes on bibliology, what is the Bible. There are classes on doctrine. They've got a New Testament class, an Old Testament class. There's a Christian history class, or a history of the church class that's going to be coming out soon. So there's all sorts of great stuff, and I can point you in the direction of that if you're even just interested in wanting to brush up on your knowing the Bible better. I can help you out and set you up with that. But this is what village missions is about. It is about making churches more spiritually vital and helping churches to become more who God has designed them to be. Here are the current open fields with village missions. Some of those are in Canada, some of those are here in the U.S. California, Iowa, Nevada, Maine, Massachusetts, Kansas, several in Kansas, some in British Columbia, one in Montana, one in Iowa, one in Colorado. So this is the reality. This is the need. And this is what helping village missions to continue to work and to exist creates the ability to help those kinds of places. It's not simply about helping an organization stay afloat. It is about helping churches that are not unlike ours to keep their doors open, to stay in existence, and to continue to share and spread the gospel in places that otherwise would not have that. There are several, you can go on YouTube, and Village Missions has a channel, and you can see several of the different kinds of churches that are out there. And one of the videos that I remember watching has this guy's the only pastor in town. There were 3 churches. There was a Catholic church, like a Methodist church, and then there was this Village Missions church, and it was the first time in decades that they had a full-time ministerial leader in their community. That is not uncommon. And these are the kinds of places. These are the new fields that were on that other graphic that I showed you. So there are several places. And so what that means also is that Village Missions continues to add and continues to seek other churches to help, continues to find other churches, or is approached by other churches that basically are at a point of saying, we are going to either have to close, or we're going to need help, or we're going to need assistance. And Village Mission says, we'll see what we can do. And so that's what's going on with Village Missions. Your investment means another rural church can have full-time leadership. Currently, 89 churches rely on Village Missions for assistance. 89 churches that without Village Missions, gone. Just gone. And I am a missionary. So many of you refer to me as pastor, and I am that, of course, but part of that process is all of the village missionaries raise support like a missionary. We raise support like a missionary, and part of that goes to continuing to support the mission. There's an administrative fee that's taken out of that, and part of that goes to pay part of our salary, because we are missionaries. And it's not simply, we'll sit back and relax and not have to worry about it, and we're safe now. It's about people who have the guts to maintain an active, responsible role in their own sustenance as missionaries. And there are many, many missionaries out there. But there are many more churches that are still in need of someone to come to their very small community. The video that we showed earlier was from interior South Dakota. And I don't know if you noticed on the sign for the town that they showed very briefly, interior South Dakota, population 67. That's smaller than this church. There are lots and lots of places like that out there that just need a little bit of help. And so one of the things that we're going to do this morning is we're going to invite our singers and our band to come forward again at this time. And we're going to close with our song, our regular song the way we do. We're still going to continue to worship. After this song is finished, I'm going to get up and we're going to signal a second offering. An offering for village missions, because it is part of our desire, part of our goal to help in whatever way we can. The church already gives a regular amount to village missions, but sometimes it's just incumbent upon us to extend to all of you who might want to help as well in a different way. So let's worship together, and then we're also going to take a second offering.